Chapter 7. Scrit. The lights of Fortinbras twinkled below Sabrina as the rocky ground of Hill 36 crunched underfoot. An ocean breeze bent the stems of a patch of hyssop, scattering the minty scent of their leaves. Her side of the hill was empty. The sentry lights slumbered, as the only movement around them was the occasional field mouse or bat swooping low to catch a meal. Sabrina sat down, her hands resting on her knees, and cycled through a series of menus displayed on her visor, flipping through them with quick snapping motions of her wrist. It was against protocol while on duty, but she clicked into the station's database to see how cases had been assigned. She found what she wanted, closed all the menus, and called Lindsey.
Slow night on the hill?
Like you wouldn't believe.
No scrits?
Not a single one. Wouldn't mind the target practice.
Stop it. I always feel so sorry for them. Are their brains really wasted?
They usually have no short-term memory. No one knows what the occultists do to them to make them that way. The one thing they do remember is that they want to find some piece of the old temple. The line was quiet. Lindsey, you there?
Yeah, just thinking about the scrits. It's sad. If Dag really wanted to put a stop to it, he could just pave over the whole hill.
He'd like to, but we don't have the materials. Although Moshi is working overtime on some new toys to pull apart the old buildings along the Bay Road.
How is Moshi?
More forgetful than ever. I worry about him. Gets worse every year. Lindsey yawned loudly in her ear. Sabrina could hear the rustle of covers.
Do you have any cheery news, or are you going to try to keep me awake with depressing things?
I checked the station records.
Depressing things, then. You trying to torture yourself?
The Orhem case is gone from the records. Wiped clean, like he never existed. Sabrina said, flinging a rock down the hillside.
The T-heads have it now. Even a civilian like me knows that.
Of course they do. But there is a case at the hospital. Enough equipment for an entire OR was stolen from a loading dock. That should go to Sean and me. We're next in line for assignment. Instead, it's listed as unassigned.
Didn't you say half of the cases never get solved anyway?
Lindsey said through another yawn. Yeah, but who can really find out who stole Miss Randashan's handbag? Who cares? She probably just forgot it somewhere. But the hospital... that is a crime that affects hundreds of people.
Was anyone hurt in the attempt?
One security guard. He's still in a coma. If he doesn't wake up, a murder charge will be added. Then it might get some attention.
Here's hoping for murder, then,
Lindsey chirped. Sabrina laughed. No, I hope he is fine. I might put my uncle in a coma if he keeps this up, though.
All the more reason to go to Lysander for school.
I'm sure you will get into Lysander arts, but my grades stink. Every time I try to study, I just think I would rather be outside running.
Can you read on duty there?
Then I'd really fall asleep. Not even allowed to talk to you.
I'm calling the police.
Sabrina's laughter was cut short by a red flash in her vision. I gotta go. The sensors are picking something up below. Probably just a deer, but I need to investigate.
Go to it. I'm going back to sleep.
Sabrina flipped to a map of the hill. Green dots represented the other cadets. They were clustered in twos, something they often did at this time of night. One slept under a tree or in a strand of bushes, while the other kept lookout, less for scrits than for supervisors who might be dropping in for a surprise visit. She was alone, her dot isolated by wide gaps of blackness. She heard a mechanical whine from higher up the hill, an all-terrain robot with built-in floodlights and additional weaponry. It tracked her motions as she moved, the only partner willing to work with her. A second sensor flashed on her screen. Something below was coming toward her. She decided to radio in her position to the other cadets. Noted. An apathetic voice replied without identifying himself or offering any backup. None of the dots on the far side of the mountain budged.
Is it because I'm a woman?
She had once asked Sean. Her yearning for his company manifested as a pang in her chest as she ducked beneath the branches of a fig tree.
Half right,
he had said. 'Cause you're a woman who's a better shot, a better fighter, and a better officer than all of them." She smiled at the memory and moved with greater determination toward her target. A third sensor tripped, this one much closer. She dialed the all-terrain's controls to stop and deactivated its lights. She was in a thicket of tamarisk trees, their low-hanging branches obscuring her vision. She moved her fingers to activate the infrared spectrum on her visor, fully expecting to see the outline of a deer. But as soon as she did, she was blinded by a flood of yellow while alarms screamed in her ears. She snapped up the visor. Lights positioned in the trees had activated, bringing daylight to the patch of hillside. The green hues of the trees reappeared, branches whipped and snapped as a figure rushed out of the thicket and up the hill. His hair was a bush, his sandals worn so much that his cracked heels poked through the soles. His clothes were ripped and ragged, flapping as he ran. Beneath the rags, visible through the gaps and tears, glistened skin that was shadowed with the distinct markings of a skrit. He had been startled like a wild animal by the lights. Exposed now, and entering the open, he made a straight path for the hilltop. Sabrina slapped the call button on her communicator. "Cadet Sabria, reporting a perimeter breach." The words would automatically send her position to the other cadets. The all-terrain responded and spun its wheels to intercept the intruder. Her legs burned as she followed him up the slope. She was close enough to clearly see the writing that covered his body. Flowing script was tattooed over every inch from his neckline to his toes. She could even see the writing on his hands as he reached down in a graceful, balanced motion, picked up a large stick, and swung it at the approaching all-terrain. Its light and camera shattered. The mechanical arm that had been probing outward to stun him went wide. A chorus of distress alarms sounded from the machine as it wheeled wildly, skidded in the loose gravel, then tumbled end over end down the hill. So much for my partner. A second bank of lights activated and poured light down on the barren stretch of open space between the intruder and the last fence. The foundation of the temple waited in the shadows beyond, wind tossing the heads of the weeds and grasses that grew from the cracks in the stone. Sabrina drew the stun rifle off her back and took aim. "Stop, or I will shoot!" Skrits were to be apprehended, but never harmed. Direct orders from her uncle himself. The intruder did not respond or slacken his pace. She charged the rifle, placed the crosshairs on him, and fired. The cylinder came spinning out with a buzz as its rear blades whirred through the air to stabilize. It struck the Skrit in the torso, latching onto his clothes with mandibles. Immediately, a blue arc of electric energy crackled in the air and dissipated. Sabrina swore. His clothes were hanging too loosely that the cylinder had fired its charge from too far away. Now she was left looking at a cloud of dust as he moved out of range of the rifle. He was above her, and that would not look good on a report. She sprinted after him as he approached another light that activated. She fired 2 more shots. One missed, and the other discharged from a flap of his trousers. Some of the charge slowed him, causing him to limp as the muscles in his legs seized, but he showed astonishing strength and pushed onward. A third bank of lights activated. Sabrina threw the rifle aside and drew a weighted snare from her belt. When she was close enough, she spun it in a circle past her ear 3 times, then released. The snare caught him in mid-stride, and he slammed to the ground with a gasp, the air knocked from his lungs. He was just a boy, a few years younger than Sabrina, his face youthful, not unlike many of her friends from school. He had a strong jaw with a glinting of gold whiskers running along it. His eyes were a mesmerizing blue, like the sky on a cloudless day. For an instant, he dug in the dirt like a dog looking for bones, but then came to his senses, looking again at the fence ahead, and back at Sabrina. She had her blaster out, set on stun. He reached to his belt and began to saw at the bindings on his leg with a knife. "Drop the knife!" It was too late. He had already cut the bindings and leapt upwards in a swirl of clothes and muscle. The fighter in her had already assessed his strength and agility. He was strong, fast, and coordinated. But, like most Skrits, he was rash and dumb. More animal than human. Nonetheless, he would be dangerous to try and subdue by hand. "Drop the knife or I'll shoot!" His feet were set in a wide stance. His eyes darted back and forth between her and his objective at the peak of the hill. The knife hovered in the air between them. She could read his intent as easily as she could read an opponent in the ring. She fired. He convulsed and fell backwards, but he rolled to his feet again and limped for the fence. A second stun after 2 partial shocks from the rifle might be too much for his system. All she needed now was a dead scrit on her record. She jogged after him. The knife was still in his right hand, while his left covered the place where she had shot him. He was no longer even running. Instead, he drew himself forward on one leg, dragging the other behind him. She approached him from an angle just as the last bank of lights activated, and she swept his legs out from beneath him with her foot. He dropped and rolled onto his back, still brandishing the knife. Her nostrils filled with the scent of his sweat and the musty smell of the desert that all scrits carried on them. She let him stagger to his feet again. Blood trickled from his forehead. His expression was dazed, his eyes beginning to water. His breath was ragged as he gasped through his lips, one of which was split and bleeding. Sabrina knew she could likely disarm him, but it was too late. He was fleeing again, his flight reduced to a pathetic limping walk, and finally a crawl. She pulled her microphone down close to her mouth. "Charge the fence!" She knew officers kept score between cadets and scrits. A scrit netted before the last fence was a point for the cadet. If they reached the fence, it was a point for the scrits. Her class had had a perfect score. Until now. The scrit stumbled the last few steps, still clutching his abdomen. He would be sore there for days. He leapt onto the fence. The mesh was already charged, and he shuddered as he came into contact with it. It was a lower charge than a stun from her blaster, and therefore safer. Sabrina walked up behind him, waiting for the initial tremors to subside, his limbs sending up clouds of dust as spasms racked his body. He was still clutching the knife, but it was not hard to pin his arm behind his back, lock his elbow, and force his grip to relax. The knife fell. He swung at her with his free hand. It was comical and wide, but angered something inside of her. She let her reflexes take control before she could think better of it, pivoting on her foot and using his momentum to swing him back into the fence. The charge was gone now, but the impact still took him unawares. His arm was firmly in her grasp. He did not realize yet that this fight was over, that he was a puppet on a string. He kicked at her. This resistance angered her even more, and the rhythm of combat took over. She delivered a punch to his lower back. Before his cry of pain ended, she turned on the ball of her foot and let fly a kick into the back of his knee. He dropped. His eyes skittered from one side to the other. His resistance was gone. She punched him anyway, taking pleasure in the way her fist landed squarely on his cheek. She punched him again on his opposite temple, and then in the center of his face, snapping his head backwards. When the other cadets appeared, he was coughing on, blood pouring from his nose. "He resisted," she said as one of her classmates neared. 5 more brought up the rear, their weapons raised, the carbon mesh and flex bands of their patrol suit glinting in the moonlight. Their visors were down over their eyes. The quiet dark of the night was ruptured by a jet that sounded like a child's scream. The gravel underfoot, the electric fences, the other cadets, and the scrit were all cast in an eerie pale glow as an Elved's dark bulk rose from a crest in the hill. The twin blue cones of flame from its turbines roared and crackled as the nozzles redirected the thrust. Tamarisk trees that had been waving gently in the breeze going out to sea whipped and shook violently, leaves exploding outward as the machine passed over. Sabrina had not known it had been lurking so close. By the looks on the other cadets' faces, neither had they. The gold-ringed black dot that usually identified the machines on the survey maps had failed to appear. The Elved passed overhead, throwing up a backwash of dust and dried needles from the trees, and filling the air with the acrid smell of methylene. Sabrina was careful not to be too distracted, and kept a hand on the shoulder of her scrit. He had begun to tremble violently, his skin covered in a cold sweat. The other cadets strained their necks to watch the machine overhead, the reflection of the lights on its shoulders and chest gliding across their visors. Sabrina noticed the machine's head swivel, taking in the entire scene. Did it linger on her and the scrit? She could not tell before the machine banked and disappeared behind the shoulder of the ridge. Cricket chirps returned. The gentle night breeze whispered in the trees. Sabrina could hear surf crashing down at the bottom of the hill. The cadets fell back into their roles, each demonstrating a sudden, earnest adherence to protocol, as if an instructor had appeared unexpectedly on the scene. Sabrina could not help rolling her eyes. She turned the scrit over, slapped bindings on his wrists, and jerked him upright. The cadet stepped aside as she led him past. Unsteady and dazed, he nearly fell, Sabrina catching him on his salt-encrusted robe. One of the cadets slipped and fell on some of the scree underfoot, trying to make way for them. "All clear," she said, stepping past without offering a hand. Cruisers were parked in a valley between hills 36 and 34. Sabrina pushed her prisoner into the back of one and set off for the station. The scrit had recovered and was keening, throwing his shoulders up against the sides of the vehicle. She glared at the switch that would seal the rear of the cruiser and infuse it with a gas that would sedate him. She did not trust the seals. Other officers complained of feeling groggy for hours after gassing prisoners. "Quit it!" she yelled, punching the mesh grill, shaking it loudly in its fasteners. Her violence stunned him. He stopped, his face lost in the shadows, his head down. Sabrina breathed a sigh of relief and turned her eyes forward to the road when the message screen on the dash blinked. "Can mercy be found in the heart of she who was born of the stone? She the origin and the devourest of all things. She the mother without mercy." Sabrina slowed the cruiser and pulled off to the side of the road. She stared at the readout. The words remained, unblinking. With the cruiser stopped, she could hear the screech of an owl, the hiss of the surf just over the guardrail. Did she also hear the faint whine of an Elved? If so, the machine was distant and pulling away. She imagined moonlight glinting silver on its wings. The sky overhead was clear, full of stars. She turned back to the dashboard message screen. Coastal Highway, north by northwest, post 8, 23 minutes to HQ. She rubbed her eyes. What did I just see? Will you help me? The scrit had pressed his face to the mesh between the front seat and back. In the soft amber glow of the streetlights, he was handsome. She thought it a shame that his mind was so ruined. She checked the dashboard message once more. It no longer seemed to be malfunctioning. With a check of her mirrors, she moved the cruiser back onto the road. On impulse, she asked, "What is your name?" "Seeker." This is new, Sabrina thought. "Where are you from, Seeker?" she said, discreetly flicking on the voice recorder. I'm not supposed to tell you. No, it's all right. I'm here to help you. You are one of the Nazarene. I'm not supposed to speak to you, he said, turning over his hands. I am here to seek. Seek what? He said nothing. They drove on for a little longer, and she noticed him looking alarmed. Already his memory had reset. Like all scrits, he could not retain more than a few minutes of memories. Where am I? You are safe. I'm here to help you, she said. What is your name? He looked around the back seat as if noticing it for the first time. He grimaced, and his eyes alighted on his hands. Sabrina noticed him studying them, reading them. I am Seeker. Where are you from, Seeker? I'm not supposed to tell you. Sabrina sighed and checked the time left before she reached headquarters. Less than 15 minutes. The young man grimaced and shook his hands, flexing and unflexing them. Do your hands hurt? He nodded. She pulled the car over to the side of the road again. On a hunch, she reached across the seat and opened the med kit. She shook a can of Stera-spray, then opened a latch on the mesh barrier between them. He recoiled. Just put your hands through. I promise it will help. She sprayed her own hand first. Only then did he slowly squeeze through both bound hands. She sprayed. The shadows mixed seamlessly with the dark markings on his skin. His palms, where he had fallen, were cut in several places. When she finished, he retracted his hands. Better? She asked. He nodded. She turned back to the wheel. Please help me. I'm scared. I can't remember anything. He reached up to touch his head and gasped when he found blood on his hands. She knew her foot should simply press the accelerator, but instead she watched as a hand, her hand, turned off the voice recorder. For a moment they both sat in silence. She tried to focus her mind on a question to ask him, but those gibberish words from the dashboard were seared in her mind. Can mercy be found in the heart of she who was born of the stone? She could feel his eyes on her while she stared out the windscreen. A civilian roll pod passed, going in the opposite direction, its headlights sending a spiny mouse on the shoulder capering into the bushes. I'm Sabrina. What is your name?
Jacob.
Her heart began to beat in her ears. She fought the urge to turn the recorder back on, afraid he would notice and stop cooperating. Where are you from, Jacob? She slowly turned in her seat. He seemed to think hard, as if trying to recall a faded memory.
The desert.
Where in the desert?
I can't remember.
Don't look down. Look at me. When you think of the desert, whom do you see?
A woman. My mother. She fled there with the others.
What others?
Others who were fleeing.
What were they fleeing from? Was it war?
Something like that. But something worse. I can't remember.
He rocked forward and struck his head with the heels of his hand. No, Jacob, you are doing so well. Who else was in the desert? She said. She wanted to put a hand on his shoulder to soothe his agitation, but the best she could do was place her hand against the screen between them. His eyes focused on it a moment. He tilted his hand to the side, and his expression changed, as if he was looking on another scene playing before him.
There were people there already. They were once our enemies, but what is on my hands?
Just some ink, Jacob. It will come off. Tell me about those people who were your enemies.
They were darker. I was afraid of them, but they helped us.
Why are they out in the desert?
To be safe from the rays.
The sun's rays? The desert does not seem to be a good place to avoid the sun's rays.
No, something worse. Something in the city.
He flexed his wrists against his bindings, the muscles in his arms rock hard, his foot kicking the screen.
I can't remember.
You are doing great, Jacob. What was in the city?
I can't remember. What am I doing here?
He began to look back and forth, pressing his hands against the windows. Jacob, tell me more about what you remember about the desert. How do you survive?
In caves near springs. And the watchers, they watch over us.
Who are the watchers?
The ones from above. Sometimes they come down. I remember when there was a sickness, and they came down to heal us. But others threw rocks at them, especially the old.
He was making no sense to her any longer. She decided to change her line of questioning. Jacob, why did you come here?
Because God is here.
The interior of the cruiser felt like it was suddenly shrinking from the weight of the night outside. Sabrina felt a shiver travel up from deep inside her gut to her shoulders, neck, even scalp. Don't say that word, Jacob. Don't ever say that word. His breaths came rapidly, and he threw himself to the far side of the seat away from her.
You are one of them. Oh, no, let me go.
He began to flail and kick at the sides of the cruiser. The vehicle rocked back and forth with his motions. Sabrina started the cruiser again. Eventually he exhausted himself, then seemed to forget why he was panicked. He looked around as if waking up.
Where am I?
Sabrina checked the navigation screen. 8 minutes to the station. I'm here to help, she said, but could not conceal the exasperation in her voice this 4th time around. He was reading his hands again. Jacob, she said. He looked up for a moment at the sound of the name. A smile crossed his lips, then faded and was replaced by a scowl. What is on the mountain?
My name is Seeker.
Chapter 8. Derp and Xandes. Jacob winced when the harsh light of the station detention zone shined through the cruiser windows. He had tried to remember more for her during the drive, but his efforts had been futile. his attempts ending with him pounding his head with the heels of his tattooed hands.
"I just don't have the words,"
he said. As she pulled to a stop, he turned his face downward into his clasped hands and mumbled fervently, praying. 2 detention officers dressed in white, their bodies padded with rubber armor, waited outside the vehicle, each clutching a sedation stick. Sabrina winced with the memory of being charged with one. All cadets were required to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end. It was far from a sedate experience. Half the class had lost control of their bowels, more than half their bladders. As she got out and the officers moved to the back of the cruiser, Sabrina felt a surge of protectiveness.
"Wait. This one is calm," she said. "At least for me."
She did not like the looks they gave her. The shorter one was named Rye. The pores of his flat nose stood out, black with dirt. He was a friend of Pitt and Boyle. The taller one was a classmate of hers named Andrew. Both lowered their sticks in Jacob's direction. Sabrina grimaced and lifted the door open. Jacob was trembling when she pulled him out. The bright lights of the bay cast him in a sickly pallor. There was more blood on him than she had realized. She had lost control, and she knew it. A wave of guilt rolled over her, and she rubbed her neck.
"Looks like you already subdued him pretty well,"
Rye laughed. Andrew looked back and forth between them before joining in the laughter. Jacob moved closer to her. He was trembling.
"Hey, Zoo. This one seems absolutely besotted with you,"
Rye said.
"Maybe we should have more lady officers after all."
"Shut it," she said, but he was right. Jacob was cowering against her, staring up at her imploringly. Didn't he remember her beating him?
"He put up a good fight. Had a knife on him,"
she said, shoving him towards the door.
"You both coming? Or are you going to stand around with your sticks up your asses?"
They followed, but neither held his stick at the ready. When they reached the processing desk, Rye and Andrew peeled off and entered the back office, where Sabrina could hear a game of pitchball on the wall screen. At this hour, it must have been a recording, but it still interested the guards more than processing a prisoner. Zandes, an administrative officer who had graduated 2 years before Sabrina, waited at the desk. She had a pinched face and dark circles under her eyes, circles that stood out all the more against her pale skin. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail. Sabrina had suspected that she had wanted to be a street officer, but like most female cadets, had been forced into a desk position. Zandes' eyes passed over Sabrina's patrol suit, and she was nearly successful in suppressing a frown before she took down a palm screen and began typing.
Location?
Hill 56, southeast face.
Elevation?
There was no reason for her to ask, except that she too was keeping score.
Area 11.
Her eyebrows lifted, but her eyes did not move from the screen. Sabrina decided not to volunteer the information that Jacob actually reached the fence. Zandes would hear soon enough.
Has he been interrogated?
Yes. He said... Sabrina stopped, shamed by a strange sense of confidence. Mostly gibberish. I captured some on the voice recorder.
Always is,
Zandes said, checking off a box on the screen. His hands were burning, though. I found the Steraspray helped.
Uh-huh. Press his thumb here,
Zandes said, holding out the palm screen. Sabrina helped Jacob reach over the counter and touch the screen. When the screen beeped, Zandes spoke into the comm piece on her collar.
Processing call.
A moment later, Alex Derp stepped out of the office where the 2 detention guards had disappeared. The sounds of the game drifted out from the open door.
"Well, if it isn't Princess Cadet."
Sabrina stiffened. "Officer Derp, a little late for you to do intake," she said. Derp scratched the expansive lump of flesh that hung over his belt. He had not shaved in days, and crumbs lingered in his whiskers. His shirt was dark with grease stains. Sabrina and others considered him a disgrace to the uniform, but he had close friends in influential places, like Pitt and Boyle. And he ran a tight detention block. There had never been an escape on his watch. His gut was misleading. Although he was overweight, his shoulder muscles still strained against the largest of shirts, and his arms were as thick as most men's thighs. It was said that when walking the detention block, he didn't even bother with armor or a sedation stick.
"Thomas was sick, so I'm filling in for him."
I heard something is going around. That is charitable of you, sir. He gave out a false chuckle. Xandy stood between them, staring at the floor, her hands balled into fists.
The boys tell me this one was besottled with you,
he said, looking over at Jacob and shifting his weight from one foot to the other.
I wanted to come out and see it for myself.
Sabrina tried hard not to look at Jacob, but she felt him trembling. He's no different than any other prisoner, sir.
Is that right? Well, having both your princesses might tame all these wretches. Maybe there's use for female officers after all.
He let out another chuckle and headed back to his office.
Officer Derp, aren't you going to process the prisoner?
Xandy said to his back.
You can do it, Xandies. We're watching the game.
Sir?
Xandy said, her inflection rising, but he had already shut the door. She slammed down the palm screen and yanked an oversized sedation stick from a locker. It whined as she charged it. She rounded the corner and yanked Jacob away by the collar.
Sabrina!
Jacob cried. Xandy stopped. Jacob was holding the edge of the counter, staring at Sabrina. Xandy's looked back and forth between them, as if not believing what she was witnessing. Sabrina did not know how to respond. In the silence of her hesitation, Jacob spoke again.
Sabrina, please don't leave me.
Xandy's grinned, revealing small teeth that were so white they were almost translucent.
Hey, Zoo, they were right. He is besotted with you. How did he learn your name? How did he remember it?
Must have caught it from one of the other officers.
Then why isn't he calling you Cadet Sabria?
I don't know, Sabrina said. But if it makes it easier, I'll come along. To help you process him. Xandy seemed to weigh the option in her mind before nodding and motioning for Sabrina to follow. She shoved Jacob ahead of her and leveled the end of the stick at him, its prongs hovering just behind his bowed neck. They passed by the door to the office as a point was scored in the pitchball match. The men's furious cheers spilled out into the hall.
Daldo! Daldo! Daldo!
They chanted the name of their favorite player.
Where are you taking me?
Jacob asked.
Shut up,
Xandy said. Just a room where you can rest for the night, Sabrina said, although it earned her a scowl from Xandy's.
First, we're going to wash the stink off you,
Xandy said, turning Jacob around a corner and guiding him into a dark room. A rubber mat covered the floor. The air smelled damp. Xandy's pushed Jacob to the center of the room, removed his bindings, and ordered him to take off his clothes. Sabrina remained in the doorway, noting the camera ports in the corners of the room and wondering if anyone was watching or if the pitchball match was being broadcast on all internal monitors. He removed his shirt, revealing a chiseled frame overlaid with extravagant tattoos. There was a slight smile at the corner of Xandy's mouth. She flicked the switch of the stick on and off, allowing a small spark to arc between prongs.
All of them,
she added. Jacob slipped off his straw sandals. They were so worn that once removed, they surrendered any semblance to shoes. Still, Jacob placed them neatly side by side on the mat next to his folded shirt. He turned aside, removed his trousers, balled them in his hands, and covered his crotch with them. Xandy's crossed to the corner where a hose was hung, taking it in her free hand and aiming the nozzle at Jacob.
Drop the trousers,
she said, punctuating the sentence with a warning shot of spray in his face. Jacob turned Sabrina's way, but she could not meet his eye. He looked pathetic. Smeared in dirt, blood, his hair askew. His pulse was racing in his neck. He set his trousers beside his shirt. Xandy's made no effort to be discreet as her eyes studied Jacob's nakedness. Her lips puckered, and she sent a sidelong glance at Sabrina before squeezing the nozzle and sending a jet of water into Jacob's crotch, doubling him over. He turned his back to her to protect himself, while Xandy's laughter echoed in the chamber.
He looks nice from this side, too,
Xandy said, shaking the hose. Xandy's, are you here to wash him or torture him? Sabrina said. Xandy's shrugged and turned the blast of water on Jacob's head. Some inevitably went into his eyes, nose, and mouth, and he began to cough. Xandy's giggled at this. He raised his hand as if to block the water. After a glare from Sabrina, Xandy sighed loudly and removed the stream from his face. While Jacob recovered, blinking the water out of his eyes, she nonchalantly turned it on his sandals. They seemed to dissolve as the stream of water swept them out of his reach. They swirled about the drain before all but the largest pieces were sucked away. Xandy's twisted the nozzle head, and the stream became more of a mist. She ordered Jacob to stand up, his arms held out to his sides. The grit and blood washed away. Water foamed and cascaded off his muscular stomach. As she stared at his body, Sabrina did feel a certain tug deep inside her. It was not carnal. Standing in the cold water, his sex was shrunken, and did not draw Sabrina's gaze the way it did Xandy's. Instead, she was mesmerized by the writing, the script flowing over his body. In his nakedness, it was revealed in its completeness. It was beautiful, proportionate, balanced, like a complete thought captured. Sabrina was seized with the same feeling she had when studying one of Lindsey's paintings, as if she were looking at something of ineffable beauty, beyond her ability to produce or describe. The writing had the grace of flickering flames, and once revealed, Jacob seemed to draw strength from it. He stood straighter, his chin up, his eyes closed in serenity. As if to challenge his rediscovered dignity, Xandy's narrowed the stream again and made Jacob turn while she sprayed it into his backside. Sabrina crossed her arms to convey her impatience. Xandy's finally turned off the water. From a locker in the corner, she removed a towel and threw it to him. While he dried himself, she produced a med kit, removing a jar of salve and bandages.
"You'll have to apply this."
She smiled and tossed them to Sabrina. She caught the first aid items and stepped forward, telling Jacob to kneel and place his hands behind his back. He cooperated while she snapped a restraining seal around his wrists, then began to open the salve container. So close to him, she was aware of his eyes. Even within the dim lighting of the showers, they were an electric blue. He had been washed free of the desert, but it was still present between them on the floor, on her uniform, drifting off to form a muddy swirl on the floor. She cleaned and dressed the gash on his forehead, then turned to one on his shoulder. As she covered it with a bandage, she felt remorse at concealing the flowing script.
"The writing. It's beautiful. Why do you all have it?"
"So we don't forget."
"Don't forget what?"
"To seek the temple, and to return."
"Return where?"
"The desert."
He stared down at the dust from her boots, mixing with the water and slipping away toward the drain. Then his eyes focused on her with an urgent intensity.
"Sabrina, you will go there. I know you will. It's where you will find the truth."
Sabrina's hand froze where she touched his skin.
"What are you two lovers saying?"
Xandy's asked from across the room. It startled Jacob. His thoughts seemed to scatter like autumn leaves in a wind, and confusion returned to his face.
"Where am I?"
"Nice job interrupting an interrogation." Sabrina spat over her shoulder.
"If that's what you want to call it,"
Xandy said, throwing a white gown their way. It fell on the floor. Sabrina tried to pick it up quickly from the wet shower floor, but it was damp, and she slid it over Jacob. It looked ugly and awkward on his frame, especially with the script now partially covered. The points, glyphs, and serifs peeked out, as if struggling to free themselves. The two women led him down a corridor to a heavy door with a thick glass window. Xandy's typed a code into the keypad next to it. Sabrina took a long breath before it opened.
"Don't be scared," she said to Jacob. "You can rest here tonight. You will be safe."
The door slid to the side. Lights flicked on the moment Xandy's entered, revealing a hall the length of a pitchball field. Identical doors with hexagonal windows faced each other from either side. Xandy's marched past them, her eyes fixed ahead of her, the muscles in her jaw working. As soon as she passed by the first door, the screaming began. Hands covered in the same black writing as Jacob's pounded the glass. Sabrina tightened her grip on Jacob, his eyes wide with terror. Panicked voices called out.
"Help, please! Where am I? Please let me out! What did I do?"
Sabrina could not imagine the confusion and utter horror of waking in a place and not knowing how she had arrived there. To make this discovery multiple times, as her memory reset over and over again, as it would be for a scrit, made her stomach twist and ache. Xandy's must have read the concern on her face. In an odd moment of understanding, she said,
"They won't remember this place once they are rehabilitated. It's unpleasant but necessary so they won't hurt themselves."
Sabrina nodded. She knew all scrits would be sent, eventually, to a rehabilitation center. Her uncle had assured her that there were treatments for scrits, and that they could make a recovery that allowed them to live happily the rest of their lives. But where they came from in the first place, what the occultists had done to them, she was not sure. No one was. Her uncle had only said that they were a tragedy that required patience, mercy, and understanding. Sabrina had never met a recovered scrit, but it was not an experience she would openly share if she had been rehabilitated. Maybe she knew rehabilitated scrits and did not even realize it. She wondered if Jacob had a family he had run away from. Had he fallen into the clutches of occultists who had brainwashed him? Would he be able to return to his family? Were they looking for him? She had processed dozens of scrits, and until this night, had never cared. They were mainly a nuisance, but now one had told her his name. He had become a person. She noticed a gloved hand thumping at a window. She had heard that while they waited to be shipped out, some scrits became truly deranged, scratching at the walls of the cells until their nails peeled away from their fingers. These had to be protected from themselves. First the gloves. Then came gags to keep them from using their teeth to chew at the gloves. Some were placed in padded cells. Animals. "When is the next transport?" Sabrina asked.
"There is one tomorrow morning," Zandes said. "That's why so many of the cells are full."
She keyed open one of the last doors. A faint whiff of urine drifted out. Jacob slowed, starting to resist. Sabrina stiffened her own grip on him. Zandes stepped inside to inspect the room. It was empty but for a toilet and a sleeping pallet against the wall.
"What is going to happen to me?"
Jacob asked, holding his ground outside the door. Out of the corner of her eye, Sabrina noticed Zandes lowering the sedation stick. "You will spend the night here," Sabrina said, putting some steel into her voice. "In the morning they will take you somewhere to restore your memories."
"But wait!"
"Trust me," Sabrina said, willing herself to detach from the whole situation, aware she had lost the distance that professionalism required. Where was Sean when she needed him? "You will be fine, Jacob. I promise." He looked to Zandes, who had her thumb poised to depress the charge on the sedation stick. He relented and let Sabrina lead him into the room, where she sat him down on the sleeping pallet. She turned immediately to leave, avoiding the imploring expression on his face and his eyes full of hope and terror. The door slid shut behind her and Zandes. She walked swiftly away while Zandes typed in a code to secure the cell, after which she tried to catch up with Sabrina.
"Jacob?"
Zandes asked, her eyebrow cocked as she came alongside Sabrina.
"You did not mention that he shared his name with you."
"Must have slipped my mind," Sabrina said, busying herself with her belt. "Can't even be sure that's really his name." Her visor, hooked onto her hip, was vibrating. She grabbed it, but knew she could not answer it in the hall, as the chorus of pounding and pleading had begun anew.
"Shut it!"
Zandes screamed, rapping on the windows with the stick. Her voice rose with every door she passed.
"Shut it! Shut it! Shut it!"
Sabrina reached the end of the corridor and was grateful to have the door closed between her and Zandes, silencing the sound of the detention officer's voice. She opened her visor. It was Sean. Relief coursed through her. She snapped it onto her forehead and noticed the hour. It was morning.
"I got a lead on our friend with the knife,"
Sean said. Sabrina wondered how he even knew about Jacob, as she had not yet filed a report. But then she realized he meant Orhem. "The one who tried to add some ventilation to your armpit?"
"The very. The deed for the shop was co-signed by an Angelo Jackson. I've got his address in my hand. I say we do some surveillance."
"Are you back?" she asked, listening to the background noise of conversations, footsteps, and intercoms that sounded like the station office.
"Discharged yesterday."
She leaned against the wall, the muscles in her back relaxing. She caught sight of her face in the screen of a blank detention monitor. She was grinning like a schoolgirl. Sean had described how he got an early discharge from the hospital. She half listened. If he was calling her, she deduced that Dag's order for her to be assigned to scrit duty had yet to filter down to Sean. Her uncle assumed that she would follow his orders without question. She had not slept all night. Sean was beginning his shift and probably wondering why she was late. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Chapter 9. Anselm Jackson. Daldo stared at Sabrina from the mural on the wall of a house on the end of a row. He was wearing his green and white Rusyn team jersey, his number 0 emblazoned on his chest and emanating light nearly as bright as the glow from behind his head. His facial features were stylized and idealized, his cheekbones sharper, his lips fuller. His eyes were irritatingly half-closed, as if he was drowsy. Off to the side in miniature were depictions of him in various moves, diving to catch a pitch ball, tackling another player, tumbling in the air like an acrobat. If she squinted, the depictions of his lithe body and those of his opponents resembled birds hovering about his head. "I should take that woman in for that monstrosity," Sabrina said when the owner of the house, a roundish woman in a gray dress, dragged a rusty cart of groceries to the stoop and began to fumble with her keys. "You don't even know if she painted it," Sean said from the seat beside her. "Likely she had nothing to do with it. Just woke up one morning and there it was, painted by hooligans." "You'd mind more if it was a Genis Club player up there." "I would, but only because a lot of them are so ugly." They were in a worn-out CRP with cloudy windows, faded paneling, and instruments with their buttons worn smooth. The seats had lost their stuffing long ago. Both of them were dressed in civilian clothes, Sean in a blue pullover and brown trousers, one of the new cuts available that year. Sabrina wore an orange blouse and green trousers over her patrol suit. Their clothes were loose in order to conceal their weapons. Sean leaned over from the driver's seat and took a closer look at the side of the house. "No candles, stones, flags, or even a basin. It does not qualify as a point of worship. It's technically just art." He was baiting her. It was mid-afternoon. They had been trailing their mark, Anselm Jackson, all day, following him on a trip to the clothing store where he was a procurement manager, and on a few visits to his distributors. Anselm had grabbed lunch from a vendor on the street before returning to his office, where he had been working at his desk since. Despite the initial thrill of tracking a possible lead, not to mention the thought of going against her uncle's wishes, Sabrina was drowsy. After a lunch of brick oven bread slathered in olive spread and rosemary, she suspected she was not the only one. Sean's head had nodded towards the steering wheel a few times. She cradled a cup of tea between her legs, but the relaxing warmth on her thighs was having the opposite effect than she intended. Banter was what they needed. She considered Sean's suggestion that the horribly proportioned and clearly illegal depiction of Daldo was art. She decided it was not. Art was what Lindsey created. This eyesore before her was just obscene. "I bet if you check the ground underneath you'll find candle droppings. The work is clearly deifying him." "After the goal he scored in the match against Trylander." "Not you two." Sean smiled and readjusted himself. It took him some time to find a comfortable position in the old, worn-out seats. A spring had been digging into Sabrina's thigh all morning. "He's just a guy, Cadet. In a couple years his numbers will drop and there'll be some other guy." She remembered one of her uncle's comments about being in the center of a cheering multitude and how it could affect the psyche. Sean broke into her thoughts. "Come on. Some of my favorite memories are of playing on the pitch and watching games with my friends. There's no harm in having pitchball heroes." It was hard for Sabrina to argue the point. She loved to play. Keep the ball from opposing players, pass it to your own, or put it in the net. It was an artificial world, free of the complexities of real life, of relationships, of sexism, of injustice. It was the fairest field she knew, besides the boxing ring. If all that mattered was physical ability, she could always excel. "People get around the flag thing," she said. "At a game the other day, I saw people waving red and blue dish towels when Trylander scored." "I imagine the old man will speak to the Minister of Dish Towels, and those colors will be discontinued next year." "There is no Minister of Dish Towels," she said, although she would not put it past her uncle to speak to the Minister of Manufacturing and Commerce to ensure that such colors were discontinued. "I've heard it said that sports are just ritualized violence, a release valve for our violent natures." Sean's eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment as he stared straight ahead. In one hand he held his cooling tea, with the other he picked at the cracked steering wheel. "You know, Sabrina, sometimes I wonder, all this the head ministry does, all this we do, to keep religion in check, to keep the sects from returning and wreaking havoc on our copacetic existence here. I wonder if it's all misplaced.
Is religion the source of all evil, or is it us?
He turned to look at her, and she felt empty. She had not expected the conversation to go in this direction. After her long, unresponsive silence, he continued.
Even the sports. We talk about them so much up here in Fortinbras. Up in Lysander, it's all about fashion.
That is where the clothing manufacturers are.
But why did the founders place them there? It does sometimes seem like a big experiment. One city focused on sports, the other on fashion.
As if on cue, a group of schoolchildren crossed the street in front of the CRP, then turned up the sidewalk. Half wore red shirts, pulled over their uniforms. Half blue shirts. One of Dag's experimental schools. To Sabrina's dismay, she could not help but notice how the children wearing the same colors clumped together. Maybe the experiments are needed, she said. Sean sipped his tea.
I don't want to be a test rat. Science has been used for some pretty evil things, too.
Sabrina drank from her own cup, chewed her lip, then offered a new subject. I saw Officer Dentry this morning. His arm was in a cast. Do you know how that happened?
Yeah,
Sean said with a chuckle.
Got too close to an Elved.
Are you serious? He nodded, his eyes again scanning the street.
Came across a nest of occultists, called in for reinforcements. An Elved was nearby, swung in low. The occultists panic. Tried fighting it. He shook his head. Stupid. Those old wasps are not lethal. At least they're programmed not to be. They'll shock and stun before they'll kill.
Not unlike our orders for the capture of Scrits, Sabrina thought. But then how did Dentry get hurt?
The occultists crossed the line. I don't know what happens or what does it, but once those things decide to take you out, you're dead. They're supposed to be able to recognize an officer by the suit, but, well, nothing is perfect. Dentry is lucky to be alive.
Sabrina gripped her cup more tightly. She wondered if Dag was aware of the force the Elveds were using. Have you ever seen them kill? Sean shook his head.
No, but I saw the aftermath. There was a den of occultists, and we called in the T-heads who called in an Elved. I was a cadet. I saw the room where the Elved cornered those people.
His eyes glazed over again.
I don't eat meat anymore after that. Can't stand the smell.
What makes them switch over to being lethal? He shook his head and pressed his lips into a thin line.
I don't know. Whatever they feel like.
They are machines. They don't feel. It must be a programming protocol. Sean shrugged and sipped his tea.
Think what you want. Those things, they don't move like machines.
You think they're remotely controlled by some T-man somewhere?
You mean from Third City?
It was Sabrina's turn to shrug. Third City was a belief among most people within the walls. Children made rhymes about it and referred to it as Turd City. It was where older siblings threatened to send younger siblings if they did not behave. Third City's a myth.
Then where do the T-men live?
Her uncle had explained to her that the special investigators had to keep their identities secret, but that they lived among the folk of Lysander and Fortinbras, just like anyone else. There was no Third City, but she could not share that with Sean. When she had asked Dag if the myths about imaginary cities among the populace disturbed him, he had laughed.
When they start talking about imaginary kingdoms, I'll be worried. But not Third City.
They probably have to keep their identities secret, she said carefully. They probably live right next door, and we don't know it.
I'll entertain that, Sean said. But then where do the Elveds stay?
I don't know. Dag's bedchamber? Sean laughed, almost spilling his tea. Sabrina smiled, but her mind was preoccupied with his question. Where did they stay? She had never seen a nest of them within the head ministry, although she knew there were rooms where she was not allowed to go. For some reason, the image from her dream a few days before came to mind. The white marble walls, a single glass column, a silver sphere inside. Where did they come from in the first place? She asked.
I always thought our dear leader created them. After all, they weren't around when our parents were kids.
Sabrina wondered, her hand touching her uniform sleeve. Pictures of Moshi's laboratory came to mind. If not Dag. All this talk of her uncle was making her uncomfortable. She did not want to reveal too much to Sean, but at the same time she was becoming aware of so many mysteries she had never questioned. I always wondered why they had the street names changed, she found herself saying.
Me too,
Sean said.
When I was growing up in Lysander, we used to play a game where we would try to find old names on street corners, pavements, curbs, the sides of houses, anywhere that the censors had missed. We had a whole collection of old street signs, bits of broken letters, and charcoal rubbings we made of engraved letters that had not been sanded away.
That was so illegal, Sabrina said breathlessly. Sean shook his head at the memory, staring out the windscreen.
I know. We'd all be rehabilitated for it now.
He sat up with a jerk, the flattened springs of the seat groaning.
Game on, cadet.
Anselm Jackson had stepped out of his office and onto the sidewalk. Sabrina set down her cup. Anselm walked off in the opposite direction. When she was certain he was not turning around, she opened the door of the CRP and followed. Anselm was a tall man, a head above just about every other person he passed on the sidewalk. It made him easy to follow. As casually as possible, Sabrina steered herself into the flow of foot traffic behind him. From what she had seen of his face, he was in need of a shave. His eyes rested in deep sockets below, a gloomy, dark brow. His hair was tapered closely on the sides, but was overlong in the back, resting on the collar of his jacket. The jacket itself was standard issue, but it was old, its cut having been declared out of style in Lysander at least 5 seasons ago. Sean had thought nothing of it, but Sabrina found a clothes merchant wearing an out-of-style jacket suspicious. Don't presume, she reminded herself. Justice required a disinterested mind. Anselm's shoulders swayed, his head bowed. Like many tall men, he seemed uncomfortable with his height. He turned off the main boulevard and headed west toward the wharves. Street vendors rolled in and out of the quays, their carts full of fresh fish, while 2 noticeably old and out-of-shape officers scanned the fish for radiation. It was not one of the more prestigious duties for officers. Most often it was seen as a punishment, or last stop before retirement. Lose Anselm, and it will be all I ever get to do. She turned her face from the officers in case one recognized her. Anselm went north next. Sabrina took her bearings. They were moving towards the blocks through a neighborhood that was a patchwork of reclaimed and non-reclaimed houses. New residences with shining fixtures and freshly painted shutters faced dusty buildings with boarded windows, their doors sealed with the crest of the security ministry prohibiting entry. She had been on more than a few calls, arresting the occasional homeless man or curious adolescent in such shells of houses. Twice she had found scrits, one alive, one dead from dehydration. At first glance, there was nothing objectionable within the sealed houses she had been inside. They often looked eerily normal, just like any other house would while its residents were out. Magazines had been left open on couches, antique communication devices rested in charging ports. A purse, a backpack hung beside a door. She had tripped over a children's brightly colored toy more than a few times. But the insidious did lurk. In almost every home there were grotesque signs left from the sects that had dominated life. Scrolls containing superstitions rolled tightly into cylinders and nailed to the walls as talismans. Suns displayed on candlesticks. Swords of all materials, wood, metal, polished stone. Some so grotesque as to have the figurine of a corpse stretched across them. These things shared walls with family photographs, calendars, thermostat controls, the mundane things of daily life so permeated with poison that no one even noticed. Insanity had become so common that it no longer seemed unusual. The victims of the cataclysm had tumbled towards the abyss in complete ignorance. It was no surprise to her that the catastrophe had caught so many of these people unaware, only that anyone survived at all. The pace of traffic, vehicle and foot, slowed on this street. Residents visited on front stairs while children played on the sidewalks. Anselm stood out with his quick pace and his lowered head, as if he had some important destination to reach and a schedule to keep. Everyone else moved leisurely, greeting and gossiping with their neighbors. Sabrina slowed and made small talk with a few women sitting on stairs while their children played in the street. When she looked up, she noticed Anselm disappearing into a house. It was a condemned building, but the plastic seal molded to the door had been split down its center. It was too dangerous to follow him inside, so she continued down the block past 3 more houses. When she was certain she was hidden by the angle of the windows, she ducked into the next alleyway. The alley was overgrown with weeds that left a yellow residue on her trousers. An empty can crushed beneath her foot. The end of the alley was blocked with scraps of warped and rotting wood fallen from the ruins of an old factory. An exposed nail snagged her coat and ripped it with a loud tear. From the windows above her head she heard 2 children singing, a wall screen playing, and a mother calling for one of her children. A teenage boy answered back in uninterested tones. At the very back of the alley, another noise caught her attention. A door, scraping the ground as it opened. She peered slowly around the corner to see the door opening, the seal of the ministry peeling off its face. Anselm emerged into the tiny space behind the houses. He descended a set of rickety metal stairs in her direction. She spun back around before he could see her, listening carefully. His footsteps, his own trousers brushed by the copious weeds, the sounds of planks of wood being set aside, the rasp of what sounded like a metal gate opening. Then nothing. She waited a few more beats, her hand dropping to the blaster at her waist before she turned the corner. Anselm was gone. She snapped her blaster out of her holster. The windows of the factory shell were high up, higher than the house's roofs. The wall was solid brick, unbroken by a door, but there was a stairwell leading down to a utility grate set below ground. The boards Anselm had positioned to the side were leaning up against a wall next to the stairs. The grate was large enough for him to have passed through. She could not follow. The grate would make too much noise as she opened it, and she could not afford to lose him now. He was clearly up to something. She decided to do away with her jacket, balling it up and tossing it into the weeds. Her trousers followed, revealing the rest of her patrol suit. A tingle ran up through her fingers as she pulled on the gloves, and they interfaced with her nervous system through derm links.
"Check in, Ace,"
Sean said when she pulled on her visor. "He crossed through a council-sealed house into an abandoned factory of some sort. I lost him when he went in through a grate that is loud enough to be heard in Lysander. I'm going to see if there's another way I can enter from the roof."
"The factory is council-sealed, too. I'm looking at its door on the other side. I'm parked by the subway entrance."
"We have him on any number of violations that we could take him in on."
"Keep following. He's doing more than taking a casual walk. Let's see where he's going."
"Affirmative." The grips on her fingertips and boots activated and bit into the skin of the factory. The wall was an easy climb. She threw herself over the crest and onto the roof filled with weeds springing up through cracks in the tarred shingles. Moldy tarpaulins rolled in the breeze, secured by only a few remaining nails. A rusty metal door to a stairwell hung wide open on the far side of the roof. The vegetation muffled her steps, but the stairwell was not as kind. Her weight alone made it creak, and it was covered with shards of glass from a shattered skylight. She reactivated the grips on her boots and gloves for extra traction and descended the stairwell's support beams. The air inside the factory was hot and close. The odor of the air was a mixture of mold and desiccated linoleum. No longer on the questionable staircase, Sabrina moved more quickly, pausing briefly at doorways and corners to listen. She heard nothing. Finally, the corridors of offices and storage areas opened to the wide expanse of the factory floor. A ray of afternoon sunlight ran from the line of windows down to crowded rows of idled machinery. Anselm was threading a path through one row to the next, his footsteps echoing loudly. Sabrina threw herself into a crouch and moved forward until the cement floor beneath her became a metal catwalk. It was too difficult to cross it without alerting Anselm, so she watched him through its metal grating until he disappeared into a doorway. When he did not reappear, she secured her grasping hook to a joist and lowered herself to the floor. The winches in the forearm of the patrol suit made the merest whisper, the vibrations causing a small rain of rusty flakes to sprinkle down around her like an industrial snow. Scavengers had done their work on the machines. Wires and wheels had been ripped away, leaving behind trails of ruined shafts and stripped bolts. Sabrina stepped around the debris with care. Anselm had slipped into a large hole in the wall that looked as if it had been made by taking sledgehammers to the brick. Sabrina approached at an angle, remaining in the cover of a conveyor belt, her weapon raised. Anselm's steps were receding. She slid through the hole and nearly lost her footing before she realized she had just entered a stairwell from the side. The scent of plaster and ceramic filled her nostrils. When her eyes were adjusted, she realized she was in the entrance to the old subway. She remembered Sean was parked outside. A blade of light stabbed through the crack in the metal plates that had been welded over the entrance by the ministry. In the dim light, she could plainly see the yellow and white tiles on the walls. Red ticket machines stood in silence, the only witnesses left of the people who had once poured through these tunnels. A sign, obscured with moisture and mildew, depicted the subway stations running in a single line, southwest to northeast. Most of the writing was in blocky letters she could not read, but on one section of the sign not obscured by mold, she saw letters she recognized but had no idea of the meaning of the words. Haifa Carmeli. A chill overrode the tingling sensation from the suit's derm links. It was the old world, uncleansed like an unopened tomb. Her instincts told her not to go forward. This place was forbidden. Unlike the shell of a house, there was no telling where these tunnels might lead, and yet Anselm was diving right into its depths. Someone had to follow. Her mouth was dry, and her chest seemed too small to contain the air she needed. Sean would be able to see her heart rate. She took deep breaths to steady herself. An advertisement depicted a smiling man and woman, a child between them. Clouds of rot crept towards them from the edges. Did they burn like all the others? She remembered images they had watched in school of the cataclysm. Bright white light, fading into a dark, sinister red. A black cloud rising from a city transformed into a giant funeral pyre. Buildings turned to dust. Columns of white smoke rising to the stratosphere, while people not obliterated in the first blast cowered and crawled, their eyes melted to ruin, their skin sliding off like layers of clothes. Her visor vibrated, and Lindsey's profile picture appeared at the corner of her vision. She canceled the call, but in a few moments Lindsey called again. Sabrina canceled it again, hoping Lindsey would get the point. Anselm was getting away. Her thighs burned as she moved silently down the stairs. He was walking carelessly now, even kicking a block of wood as he passed it. The turnstile's arms slammed as he pushed through. Sabrina took advantage of the noise and the echo to take a few generous strides forward before ducking behind a ticket machine. A rat scurried from beneath it. Anselm was relaxed, whistling even. She activated the grips on her boots and walked up the side of the wall, bypassing the turnstiles. When she reached the platform, she was not sure which direction he had turned. The echo of his whistle seemed to come from all sides, but the flash of his palm light gave him away. He was headed up the tracks where the trains once ran into the highlands of the city. A message flashed across her vision and read, "Sabrina, it's an emergency. Come to my apartment, quick. L." What could have happened to Lindsey or her family? But as quickly as the alarm hit her, she partitioned it from her consciousness. She had a duty to fulfill, and if Lindsey was able to type a message and was home in her apartment, she was not injured or in danger. Seats were set up in semicircles for waiting passengers. Sabrina moved from one to another, using them as cover, until they ran out, and she reached the end of the platform. The subway climbed into the hills above the city at an angle. Anselm was already far into the tunnel. "I'm following him into one of the subway tunnels," she whispered into her microphone. Sean's response was garbled. There was not good reception underground, but to Sabrina it sounded like affirmative. She set her feet down on the rail and walked along it slowly. It allowed her to move more quietly than if she had walked between the tracks. The tracks were at an angle. She imagined the line running up into Hill 36, where she had caught Jacob the night before. Anselm was descending, his feet slapping the tunnel floor as he jogged downward. His footsteps and the occasional stone or piece of debris that he kicked made it sound as if he were right in front of her. When she clicked on the night vision of her visor, an emerald world appeared before her, the tracks clearly visible as well as Jackson's lumbering shape, the tails of his jacket billowing as he moved. They continued for some time, through another station in which he remained on the tracks, but Sabrina climbed up and crossed using the platform before jumping back into the tunnel. Not long after that, Anselm stopped and turned his light back towards her. It was too weak to reach, but she ducked and turned the visor away so as not to offer a reflective surface. When she looked again, Anselm was bent over, His arm jerked, and the tunnel reverberated with a loud bang, followed by 2 others. Sabrina charged her blaster. Was this some sort of alarm? A wedge of light opened up over him, accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. Another man waited above. They exchanged a few short words before a rope ladder dangled down, and Angelo climbed up. The door slid shut again, and Sabrina was left in darkness. Alone, she waited a long time, wondering if she had wandered into a lair or a trap. Red lettering flashed again before her eyes. 3 more messages from Lindsey had come in a bunch when she had entered the last station and had reception. Now she was cut off. She quickly adjusted the frequencies on her visor, shutting out any communiques other than those from Sean, but even the line to Sean was dead. He would have no idea where she was, unless she surfaced. Her mind was made up. Sabrina followed in Anselm's footsteps, switching back and forth between night vision and infrared, until she found the hammer, the handle still glowing turquoise from the heat of his hand. 3 crescent moons still burned indigo on the track where he had struck. Sabrina took a deep breath and pounded 3 times. There were smudges of fading warmth on the door. She had not heard the passwords, nor would the guard above know her. It was entry by force, or no entry at all. As soon as the door cracked open, she fired the grasping claw from her forearm past the guard's head. Sensors in her glove told her it had anchored onto something, and she engaged it at full leverage. Her arm felt as if it would be torn from her socket as she flew toward the opening. There was a pain from her leg that felt like her knee exploding when she burst into the room. The door guard fell back in shock. She glimpsed unshaven cheeks, a jowly face, and the flash of a knife before she fired her blaster. He shuddered, the breath leaving his body in a loud gasp, his chest deflating beneath an old shirt with a checkered design on it. The grasping hook whined back to her and snapped into place. She was in a large room with rusting steel supports and high windows cloudy with dirt. A closed door with frosted glass led into the hall. Another factory shell. The man's spasms were subsiding. His pants were wet from the stun constricting and releasing his bladder muscles. She checked his pulse. It was steady, but by the way his eyes had rolled backward, she was confident he would not be waking soon. He had been sitting in an easy chair, its skin patched by packaging tape. On the arm rested a tiny notebook with cramped writing. She took a closer look. She could not read it, but it looked familiar, the same writing that was on Jacob. Some of the writing was also similar to what she had seen on the advertisement at the subway entrance. She slipped it into her pocket as evidence. She flexed her knee. The frame of the trap door had struck it as she had come up. When she took a tentative step, pain shot through her like a hot razor. She would have a bruise like none other. She limped towards the door and opened it slowly. Cool air blew on her face with a strange sweet smell that she could almost place. Voices echoed in the hall outside, but they were distant. A check of the infrared showed her no fresh footsteps aside from Anselm's, and no warm bodies nearby. She stepped into the hall. To the right was a blind, unlit corner. To her left, metal rafters hung over an empty space. The voices came from that direction. From what she had learned from the last factory shell, she guessed she was again in the office or control space that looked down on the factory floor. She moved in the direction of the voices. A control room was to her left. Within, a chair rested on its side, and wires dangled from the bottoms of panels, their dead screens reflecting her silhouette. Her foot nudged a rusty screw that rolled across the floor with a disturbing noise until it stopped against the wall. She held herself motionless, but the steady drone of the man's voice below did not waver. Paint chips fell in her face and on her shoulders as she pressed against the wall. She copied her approach from the last factory shell and dropped to hands and knees as she neared the corroded catwalk at the end of the hall. One head appeared first, the head of the speaker. He was in a space cleared of machinery. In its place, a floor of polished concrete that was set aglow by rows upon rows of candles. Sabrina's mind flashed back to the evening at Joe and Magdalene's. That was the smell. But there were dozens of tapers below flanking the speaker, resting on tall metal stands or cupped by glass sconces. He stood within a tight triangle made by 3 posts, each holding one of the gold-glowing symbols Sabrina had learned to dread, a moon, a sun, a sword. Surrounding the speaker in row after row were people. Sabrina was amazed that so many people could fill a space and still be so quiet. She was not surprised to see a semicircle of a dozen in the front row, but the farther she moved onto the catwalk, the more rows there were. Bowed heads, upturned faces, teary, enraptured eyes. She leaned onto the catwalk as far as she dared before she gave up. There were too many. She could not see where they ended. The occultists filled the space, sitting on polished benches, throw pillows, or even beach towels. Her palms left wet handprints on the floor as she crab-walked backwards. Sweat was dripping off her brow like tears. A green bar on her visor's readout indicated that she had full reception. She stood up, her knee protesting, and hobbled back to the end of the hall. She would hide in the dark and call Sean, call for reinforcements, call the entire ministry down on this place. She was waiting for her when Sabrina turned the corner. The rifle, an old projectile shooter, was pointed in Sabrina's face. Like someone as familiar with the weapon's workings as a soldier, like someone trained, Lindsey chambered around, the metal snapping and slapping with a crack that split the silence and echoed from one end of the factory to the other.
"Sabrina," Lindsey said. "I told you not to come."